at music in and of itself, it's interesting that music is a reflection of what we think and how society actually functions. Most musicians, as they write songs, they will look at what's going on in their own life, as they look at what is happening in their surroundings, what is happening in their society, the different experiences. They would write these songs, and that's really what it is. It's a very good way to gauge what is happening in society and what is happening around us, is to listen to some of the songs and the words that are surrounded by it. One thing that I found out, and as I was thinking about music in and of itself, back in the early 2000s, there was a survey that was done by Rolling Stones. And I found it very interesting that they did a survey around what is the greatest rock and roll songs ever written. Rock and roll music has been around for quite some time, and they were doing the survey on it. The first song that was on the list, it was this, the song basically goes about talking about a man who was doing very well, very wealthy, and as the days went by, he's homeless. And the man is walking down the sidewalk, and all he sees is a little stone that's kind of rolling along the side of the sidewalk. And the song basically says, life is nothing more than a rolling stone. Okay. Number 2 on that list is also very interesting. Some of you might know this song. It's by the Rolling Stones. They're probably the more famous song by them. It's called I Can Get No Satisfaction. When you go through life, and you go through different aspects of life, you kind of wonder, what is life all about? Right? I want you to remember one word, and if you were here for JB's testimony, he kind of brought up this word. The word is hevel. I want you to remember this word, hevel. It's a Hebrew word, and we want to look at this word itself, and it's interesting. I've been kind of meditating on it for the last couple of months, and I thought I'll share a little thoughts about this word called hevel, and I'll explain to you what this means. My daughter the other day, she was talking to me, and she's a senior in high school and about to graduate, and she's thinking about where she's headed in life and all that different things. And she made an interesting quote, and I don't know if it's original with her, she says it is, but I found it very, very interesting. She said, life is nothing more than a countdown to death. I was like, that's kind of a depressing thought process, isn't it? Life is nothing more than a countdown to death. And I said, but technically, that's correct, right? The word hevel literally means smoke. Does not work. Oh, I gotta turn it on. It means smoke, and the word is used many times in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's translated vanity in our language, in our English language. It's also translated meaningless in certain translations. I don't know that it's necessarily the most accurate translation. The translators did the best job in terms of translating in vanity or meaningless, depending upon how you look at it. But life is like smoke or vapor. So if you turn with me to the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 1, we're going to try and work our way through the book of Ecclesiastes and think about this word called hevel, or smoke, or vapor. The author of this book actually kind of lays this out. It's interesting. It follows right after the book of Proverbs. When you look at our life as believers, we may look at, hey, I want to read the book of Proverbs and learn wisdom. And as you go through the book of Proverbs, you'll see the fact that there's a character in the book of Proverbs called Wisdom. She is a female character. It talks about how you should follow wisdom. You should gain it. It's more worth than gold and silver. And life will be good if you live with wisdom. Well, hold on a minute. Is life always fair, even for a person who lives in wisdom? No. Not necessarily. And that's what the book of Ecclesiastes is all about. The book of Ecclesiastes is a wisdom book, and he comes out and says, yes, we may say about wisdom, you try to make all those right decisions. Half the time I don't even know if I'm making the right decision until afterwards, but I'm thinking I'm doing the right things. And the author says, oh, wait a minute. Let's think about what life looks like. Let's look at what society looks like. Oh, generations comes through, and if you look at all of that took place in life, the preacher, as a character, is called in the book of Ecclesiastes. It says in verse 2, Hevel, Hevel, says the preacher. Hevel, Hevel, all is Hevel. Or some translations would say vanity, vanity, all is vanity. But life in and of itself is not always vain. And it's not always meaningless. There's some value to life. But what does that mean? What does that look like? It's not, yes, it is a countdown to death. Somebody told me the other day that the day that you're born, you have an appointment that's already made. You can't be late for it, and you can't even try to avoid it. And that appointment is death. Now that is one of the major themes of the book of Ecclesiastes. And if you look at it, the author actually, or the preacher, brings out three major aspects of life itself. And the three big aspects of life itself is time, death, and justice, or unfairness, or fairness of life itself. Fundamentally, there's a question that's there that the author brings forward is, what is the point of life? And what is the purpose of life? At first, as we go through this, don't get me wrong, there's some goodness that will come out of this message. It's a personal reflection a little bit about maybe a depressing question marks that I'm facing myself. And you may be facing the same thing. Because when you think about it, you and I have no control over time. Right? It is the most valuable commodity you and I have. I can create more of it. I can create less of it. I can try to manage it, but in reality, I can't even manage it in many ways. Think about it. You had no control over when you were born. You have no control over when you die. Even if you try to commit suicide, you don't have control over it. Because there's plenty of people who have attempted and still survived. You don't really have any control over who you're born to. You don't have any control over where you live, what you do. You might even say, I want to live in this city, I want to live in that city. Some of you know my story that for many, many, many years I did try to move down to Atlanta. I was like, oh man, it'd be really nice to live down in Atlanta. I like the greenery, it's warmer weather and things like that. And after about 30 plus years in the state of Minnesota, God said, okay, you're going to move down south, but it's going to be to Dallas. I really didn't want to move to Dallas because it's a concrete city after all, right? But as we moved there, we've enjoyed it. The Lord has blessed us in that sense. I didn't really have control over it. For a long time, I was looking for jobs. First in Atlanta, and then later on, I said, maybe Lord, you might want me to move down to Dallas. And so I said, okay, let's go look for jobs down in Dallas. My wife's parents and family are down there. And for about 2 years, I attempted to find a job in Dallas. Nothing. It's not that I wasn't qualified. I was applying for jobs that I was overqualified for. I still couldn't find a job down there. God said no. And when I stopped and I said, okay, whatever you want to do, Lord, I'll wait. Somebody called me up out of the blue a colleague of mine from 5 years that I hadn't been in touch with. He called me up, hey, I got an opportunity for you. We talked about it. It was perfect. It was great. It was a good situation. And we moved down there. I didn't have any control over that, did I? When you think about time in and of itself, what is it really taking us? Let's go to chapter 3, if you don't mind. And one of the things that we think about is we think about life and time and how we use it. A big part of our life is the work that we do. In verse 9, the preacher says this, what profit has a worker from that in which he labors? I mean, we take our time and we work. Great. And later on, the author does say work is a gift from God. But we labor and you work and you put forth all this effort in life. What's the point? Mark Twain said this once. He said, we live in a world where a man is recognized for an hour and forgotten forever. Think about that. you think about accomplishments and accolades and things like that, most people can't remember who won the Super Bowl, championship like from 4 years ago or 3 years ago, let alone last year half the time. The Toronto Raptors won the championship with NBA last year, but come this year, nobody's going to think about it because, why he's not there anymore. They're recognized for a moment, forgotten forever. That's also true in each one of our lives. We think about leaving behind a legacy and things like that, but really, what is that legacy? Most people won't even remember it after some time. So when you look at our lives, when you think about how God takes us through it, we have no control over time. We live that life. Now, what does that look like? Second thing that we notice is the fact that there is death. Right? You and I have no control over death. When you think about death in and of itself, it is a countdown. Our life is nothing more than a countdown to death. We don't like to think about it. We try not to think about it, but somebody also said there's a study that's going on National Public Radio. There's a program that I overheard the other day. They're doing a study on the amount of time an individual consciously or unconsciously thinks about death. It's amazing. Unconsciously, we think about death a lot. If we didn't, we wouldn't be so careful about how we live and the germs that we take on. Right? When we get a small little health case, we will go attempt to take care of that. Why? I want to die. Right? I mean, to extent of how much we get into the medical field, why? I don't want to die. We think about it all too often, don't we? Turn to chapter 9 if you would. We'll come back to chapter 1 and trace our way through in a minute. Just want to give a quick overview on these three major themes that the preacher is bringing forward. Just think about time that we have no control over, death we have no control over. Chapter 9, starting in verse 2. It says, all things come alike to all. One event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good and the clean and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and him who does not sacrifice, as is the good, so is a sinner, he who takes an oath, as he who fears an oath. This is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that one thing happens to all. Truly the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil, madness is in their heart while they live, and after that they go to the death. It really doesn't matter if you're a believer or an unbeliever, we're all headed to death. So what's the difference? What's the difference? I mean, same thing happens to a believer and an unbeliever. It's not like, believers are immune from cancer because they're believers. It's not that we're immune from turmoils in life. The other day we were talking about, the justice of God, and one of the open questions that came up was, is it fair that one island gets wiped out by a hurricane while other parts of the world is nice and lush and great? How is that fair? When you think about it, we have no control over time, we have no control over death. And another theme that the author brings forward is life is unfair, or justice. I mean, we hear of stories, and some of you may even have faced situations where you do the right things, but you just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Is life fair? Look at chapter 3 if you would. Chapter 3 and verse 11. The preacher says this, he has made everything beautiful in its time. Okay, great. Also, he has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from the beginning to end. When you look at what is God really doing from the beginning to end. Verse 12, I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their life. But then the author goes on to talk about the injustice that exists under the sun. Look at verse 16. Moreover, I saw under the sun, in the place of judgment, wickedness was there. In the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. What is God doing? And in this context, the preacher goes on to say, how do I live in this life? If I try to live in this life, and I try to say I'm going to control, what happens in my life and the goodness and all that stuff, but then all of a sudden it takes a left turn and it goes to a situation where it's not what I expected. And so often when you even look at an individual's life and you go back and look at your heritage or your family's life or people before you, it doesn't make sense why certain things happen in different situations. And you can even look at a person's life and it says, it's not a good life. They try to be a good person, and it's not a good life. They end up in bad situations. Sin comes in, maybe not your own sin, somebody else's sin comes in and just devastates your life. As I live in this world where I have no control over time, I have no control over death, I have no control over justice, the open question is, what is the purpose in life? So, we try to answer this question in life in many different ways. The word hevel, or vanity or meaningless, is used 38 times in this book. It is a major theme of what it is. And the whole premise is you're trying to figure out what is happening with life. How should I live? What is the purpose of life? And so, going back to chapter 1, we see the preacher going on to look at the whole question of, is life pointless, or does life have a purpose in and of itself? Now, we tried to define this question in many different ways. I've kind of put out a couple of them here, and I'll go down the list really quick and for you to think about. First of all, a person might say, wisdom and knowledge is a good thing, because as I gain wisdom and knowledge, there might define for me some purpose in life. After all, in the book of Proverbs, it tells us, seek wisdom, seek knowledge, and the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Great, I'm going to fear the Lord. I'm going to do all these different things. I don't know exactly how that looks like, but at the same time, I'm going to try to gain knowledge. At the end of chapter 1, we read this, after the person tries to gain so much knowledge, in verse 18, for in much wisdom is much grief. It doesn't seem satisfying, does it? And he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. Well, that doesn't help me out. What am I supposed to do? The first 3 items over here is kind of interesting. You can kind of trace your life starting in college as you go down this list. What do you go to college for? To gain more wisdom, to gain more knowledge. And you get to college and you study hard and you pick up all this information, and you realize after 1 or 2 years that your professors really don't know half the time what they're talking about either. And they're just pointing you to go to different places to go gain information on your own. Yeah, they might have some information, they've done studies and stuff. Don't get me wrong. If you're planning to go to college, please go to college. It's a good thing. Right? It might seem contradictory based on what I'm saying here. But it's bad to gain knowledge. If you're trying to understand and find purpose in your life based on your degree and the education that you have, you'll be greatly saddened by it. Because here it says it will increase grief and increase sorrow. Well, okay, if wisdom and knowledge is not the best course of action in terms of finding satisfaction, well, I'll get satisfaction through pleasure. Let's go at it. In chapter 2, verse 1, and you guys all know where this is headed. In verse 1, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure, but surely this also was vanity. I try to chase after pleasure. I try to go to satisfy the lusts of my flesh, and I find out very quickly that it doesn't satisfy. Okay, fine. Maybe if I work hard and work at it and get involved and put forth effort, I'll find some satisfaction. After all, God says, we should put forth that effort and work hard for him. Chapter 2 and verse 11, the preacher says this after he has put together all these different desires of his heart by working hard. In verse 11, then I looked at all the works that my hand had done, and all the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun, because it didn't satisfy. Yes, I might gain some wealth, I might gain some pleasures along the way, I might gain some knowledge I can tell other people and pass along information. That doesn't really satisfy. The author will go on to say, well, I'm out of college now, I should probably settle down into a family, and if I do what other people do in a family, in a home, there might be some satisfaction. Now I have children, great. As I have children, I should do my best to pass along to my children benefits, right? You might work hard, put them through college. You might save up some inheritance you want to pass along. You have a house and a property you pass along, and all those various things. And at the end, when you work for your children for many, many, many years, the author says this in chapter 2 and verse 18. And I love this one because my kids are just getting out of high school and getting off to college, and we're wondering, did we put enough effort into their life? Are they going on for the Lord? And where are they headed in their life? In chapter 2 and verse 18, the author says, then I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. Your children, by the way. Verse 19, and who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? But yet he will rule over all my labor in which I toiled, in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. I have no idea what my kids are going to be like. They might be fools for all I know. And so I put all this effort into their life because I'm trying to find purpose in it. It's interesting, you think about families and marriages, there's a statistic that's done that at about 7 to 8 year mark is when you have the highest rate of divorce amongst married couple in the United States. And really, it's consistent throughout the world. And the reason is because you have maybe 2 or 3 children by this time. One is in school, and then you have a terrible 2 person at home, and you can't manage them both. The wife is working so hard to take care of it. The husband is ignored. The husband puts forth the effort because they got to pay for all this stuff, and they forget about each other, and they get into a divorce. It's also very interesting. The second highest time when a couple gets a divorce is at 26 years. And here's the reason why. They spent all this time helping their children get through college, and when their children have left the house, they look across the dining room table, they don't know who they're sitting at. They forgot about each other. Because they worked for their children, they have no idea if they're going to be fools or not. That's not satisfying either, is it? The preacher goes on in chapter 3 and verse 19, and I like this. It can be very depressing. After a while, the preacher says this, verse 19 in chapter 3, for what happens to the sons of men, and what happens to animals? He goes down and says, okay, let's just take all things out for it. Let's just look at creatures across the world. And he compares man to an animal. One thing befalls them. As one dies, so dies the other. Surely they all have one breath. Man has no advantage over animals, for all is vanity. That is kind of the thought process when you think about life is nothing more than a rolling stone. So what is the purpose? What is the point? In chapter 4, we see this idea of accumulation of wealth. They have accumulated all this wealth and various things. In chapter 4 and verse 7, we read the author saying, okay, great, I got all of this. In verse 8, then I returned and I saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone without companion. He has neither son nor brother, yet there is no end to all his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches, but he never asked, For whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and great misfortune. The one who accumulated all this wealth, wanted to leave it to their children. Oftentimes, the children don't even want your wealth. Because from their perspective, it's pennies. Because they're so much better off than you are, most of the time. And then you have all this, because what did I do all this for? Well, the preacher goes on to say, well, maybe I can influence. You know, I'm older. People look at me a little more wiser. I can provide a little more influence in this society. And so the author goes on to say, take my wealth, okay, with my wealth I can get some power. I'll list out a few more of these. What about power? I can take my power and influence society. I might get involved in the local community, you know, get involved in the board of my HOA, or I might get involved in the city council or whatnot. In chapter 4 and verse 13 we read this, better a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who will be admonished no more. For he comes out of prison to be king, although he was born poor in his kingdom. I saw all the living who walk under the sun. They were with the second youth who stands in his place. There was no end of all the people over whom he was made king. Yet those who came up afterward will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and grasping for the wind. You can influence and power, but I guarantee people won't listen after a while. They don't get satisfaction there either. I have all this abundance. You get the point here in chapter 5, verse 10 and 11. All this abundance, you look at it, there's blessings and all this stuff, and it's like, what is the point? Okay, now, I'm a little older, wiser, I've chased after the wind amongst the world and everything else. Now, maybe I should turn to God. I will bless God. I'll become a little religious. I'll get involved in church. I can help somebody become a better person by bringing forward religious things, the goodness of following a true and living God. Okay, great. Look at chapter 6 and verse 1. We read this. There is an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is common among men. A man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that he lacks nothing for himself of all his desires. Yet God does not give him power to eat of it, but a foreigner consumes it. This is vanity and an evil affliction. And so you think about, I can tell other people about the goodness of God, but I've never enjoyed it my whole life. And because I didn't enjoy it, what am I passing along in terms of influence and blessing other people? What about desires? You have all these the various desires. I actually skipped through one of them that I want to come back to in a minute. And, I have all the various desires and aspirations. Even if I fulfill those aspirations, I don't find satisfaction. The funny part is it got so bad for the preacher in chapter 7 and verse 6, we read this. Surely oppression, for like a crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. You might try to be happy in your old age, but if the whole thing behind you was like smoke and vanity, is nothing more than crackling of thorns under a pot, it says. In one I do want to go back to is this idea of preaching. Go back to chapter 5. I bring this up because sometimes, we try to see there's satisfaction in preaching. There's satisfaction in getting involved in God's work and being busy and hard-working, all those various things in the local church and preaching and things like that in chapter 5. And I was really convicted of this because I do get the opportunity to share behind the pulpit every so often. But in verse 6 of chapter 5, it says this, do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuses and destroy the works of your hand? For in the multitude of dreams are many words, there is also vanity. But fear God. Now, I say this is because there's different context in this. One aspect of it is I can share and speak and talk and all these different things, so people might even listen to it. But in and of itself, it doesn't provide any satisfaction. In the end, after I'm gone, I know we're getting recorded and everything else, I can go back and take a look at that. But they say after you preach, the congregation only listens or hears 10% of what you spoke. That's all they remember in a week. Fast forward 1 week after that, and they say it's 10% of that 10%. And fast forward 1 more week, and it gets less. Well, what was the message last week? I were to ask you right away. Could you remember it off the top of your head? Probably not. There might be a pencil that you write down with paper, and that might help you. But there's not a whole lot of words, is there? Michael Card said this in one of his songs. You and me, we use so very many clumsy words. The noise of what we often say is not worth being heard. What is the point of life? Is life unfair? Is life something even worth thinking about and living? What is the purpose of life? Becomes the open question. When somebody thinks through this, and everybody will come to this point in their life, what is the purpose of life, is one of the main reasons where there's so many depressions and mental health issues that we have in life today. Because you start thinking about all the various things that happen in life, and it's like, what am I here for? Let me conclude what the author says and turn to chapter 12. Now, the preacher himself doesn't say anything because he doesn't know. Life is not fair. There's light, there's darkness. It's interesting. If you're young, just wait a minute, you'll be old. Right? You can go out and enjoy your weekends. Somebody said, go have fun. Monday always comes. Right? What am I here? What am I supposed to do? How do I live that happiness, fulfilled, purposeful life? Turn to chapter 12, if you would. In verse 6, we'll start there. Remember your Creator before the silver cord is loosed, before you die, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher shatters at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the well. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. Vanity of vanity, says the preacher, all is vanity. It's nothing more than smoke. In verse 9, and moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yes, he pondered and sought out and set in order many proverbs. And the preacher sought to find acceptable words, and what was written was upright, words of truth. The words of the wise are like goats, and the words of scholars are like well-driven nails given to one shepherd. And further, my son, be admonished by these, of making many books there is no end, and much study is wearisome to the flesh. You can study and burn yourself out, it says. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. And this is the interesting part of it. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is man's all. It's an absolute statement that's being made here. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. It's interesting, when you think about life in and of itself, the Proverbs will say wisdom is better than you have a good life when you have wisdom. But the Ecclesiastes, in one sense, can contradict this. I can live that wise life and still end up in a bad situation. But the preacher doesn't say that all things that happen in life is a bad situation. Here, at the end, he concludes the fact that you fear God, keep his commandments, for this is man's all. How do I do that? Becomes the open question. If you go back a little bit to what gives a person satisfaction at a personal level, God actually is the one who created me. And in his creation, he actually brings about events in life. What's the point of those events? Simple things where you can find enjoyment. The preacher says, enjoy a good meal. Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and verse 24. Work hard and enjoy the fruits of that labor. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 13 and chapter 5 and verse 18. Be satisfied just spending time with your family and enjoying your children and your grandchildren. You know, it's one of those situations, we work for so many other things outside of what God has given to us. Because we chase after wealth, we chase after pleasure, we chase after satisfaction, we chase after power, we chase after abundance. If you just live what God has given you, the conclusion here is you'll be satisfied. See, man's all is one to remember God who is his creator and fear him. Because God's the one who gives anyway. It doesn't matter how much I try to get something, I won't get it until he wants to give it to me.
Amen.
And even if I try to do something, and I think I have it all great, in a moment it can all be taken away without me even knowing about it. Think about the life of Job. I mean, Job is looking at this whole situation and saying, God, what did I do wrong? It describes him as a just man. God even pointed to Job, have you considered Job a good, just man? A day later, his life was turned upside down, and God allowed it. In that whole thing, when Job looked at the conclusion of it all, and he went face to face with God, and the interesting part is, God never answered Job's questions. God looked at him and goes, who are you, Job? I'm God. Fear God and keep his commandment, and the enjoyments that I have given you, you enjoy. But this is man's all. Matthew chapter 18, if you would. One last point, and we'll close. Matthew chapter 18. We read in verse 1, at that time the disciples came to Jesus saying, who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Then Jesus called a little child to him and set him in the midst of them, and said, assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted and become a little child or little children, you will be by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. Yes, I'm not going to talk about the evangelism to the children. Think about what Jesus Christ was pointing out here. The question is, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? I mean, who is in that position of being in the center of who God is and everything? Be like a child. Now think about, how does children behave? For those of you who have children, I would love to be a 5-year-old kid. You know, after you reach, get past 40 years old, I want to go back and be a 5-year-old kid. Because parents have taken care of everything. I can have all the fun. I can learn, I can play, I can enjoy. I think the most content group of people in the world, most satisfied group of people, is 5-year-olds. And God said, be like one of them. Enjoy the kingdom of God. Because He provides it. He provides everything that you and I have. And there's nothing for me not to be satisfied. I don't have to be like that musician that says life is like a rolling stone. Yeah, it might be a rolling stone, man, but it's a fun rolling stone. I don't have to go at the end of this life and say, I don't have satisfaction. Because God provided everything I need for satisfaction. Because Fanny Crosby said, all the way my Savior leads me, What have I to ask besides? Can I doubt his tender mercies, who through life has been my guide? Heavenly peace, divinest comfort, here by faith to him to dwell, for I know whatever befalls me, Jesus be with us. Let's go to the verse. Father, we thank you for your Son, Lord Jesus Christ. We thank you for who he is. We thank you for how you take each one of us individually through different paths in life. I cannot imagine or compare what is happening in someone else's life because you have given them what you wanted to give them, and you've given me what you wanted to give me. We thank you for how I can enjoy every moment and every situation and everything that happens in my life. I might look at it as a bad situation because it's a struggle, but Father, you brought various things into our life for us to enjoy that moment. Because I don't necessarily have the next moment yet until you give it to us. And so we thank you, Father. Help us to fear you in knowing that you control our time. You control our circumstances. You're the one who provides. You're the one who protects. You're the one who gives us satisfaction in this life that is nothing more than smoke. We thank you for the fact that even though we may look at smoke as being meaningless, yet there is purpose behind it that you give. And how it is all because of you. And so, Father, help us to just simply trust, even as the psalmist says, to be still and know that you are God. So we ask for your guidance in that. Help us to live like that on a daily basis. And as we part now, we just pray that you would take us where you want us to go. We thank you for how you work in our life, and we just pray for all this in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
No, sir, I'm Danny. Bradley. So I gotta keep an eye on you because you're like. Hey, welcome, brother. Are you also from Jamaica? You guys are picking up the storm in Doha, right? Coleman won 100 years. He's US guy, 100 meters. I like that guy. Usain Bolt. That was so. Even Obama did it. Have you seen that picture where Obama does it? And he says, if I get a bigger picture. You guys are not
Can you give me something for me?
I was watching the third test in Adelaide. I watch things like that. My bag was like
Work is a gift from God. Enjoy that gift that God has given you. It's only enjoyable if you realize enjoy the family that you give them. Enjoy the meal that you have because that's from Because you can't. I didn't say enjoy the world. I said enjoy the blessing that God has. Yes, as you mature in a Christian life, a person can say, yes, I want to give glory to God, because now I understand that. The person is not of that mature state. Somebody is going to start trying to get to understand the life of God. Then God the blessing is giving us perspective and awareness where it comes from. And as you mature, you not every message is about the glory of God. even the Psalms, during the Psalms are about the glory of God.
You couldn't come to the end and say, go to the verse that says, seek the Lord while he may be found. You couldn't. I know, you wouldn't be part of the child. The child is the world says, hey, the world
they're not enjoying it. No, that's before you get there, you got to go through this journey of getting to understanding eternal perspective. And the person who is further along in the Christian life, but the person who is not, without God, which they can never be married. They can eat and drink all they want, but one day always comes. Right? Without God, you can't be married. And that's the point. Yes, I don't have to know the glory of God and the attributes of God, all these various things. You understand that God is good and joy, but everyone has that day. A person who is not as mature, who is born from life, many years of life experience all those various things, may not understand the details of who God is. I mean, you can know all the details of God. You learn about God. But that's what the maturity aspect comes through. But a person who is going through it, I'm going through the world, I'm asking how I am different.
All right, we'll have a good
person out there.
Thank you.
I mean, there are many young people who are in churches.
Oh, do you want
We speak about the glory of God. God is glorious. God is glorious. Chase after the glory of